name is Cathy Andrews. I'm the Senior Librarian for Adult Services at the Salinas Public Library in Salinas, California. Thank you everyone for being here. Let's get right to the slideshow. I think the biggest thing for me with maps, I actually did my undergraduate degree in forestry, which meant I was out in the woods a lot, and maps made a real difference to every day of work we did out in the woods. I also, as a kid, really enjoyed looking at maps, trying to figure out information about different places. I especially appreciated old maps. At the same time, I love the new mapping technologies that are available. I rely on satellite to help get me places, and I'm happy to do that, but I still love old maps. There are all kinds of different maps in the world. We were talking about, I mentioned about driving somewhere. You can use a physical map. You can have a map on your phone. You can plug the map into your car's computer. There are maps for things, all kinds of things. Plant hardiness zones. When it comes to using maps for genealogy, there are lots of different kinds of maps from lots of different time periods. There might be maps of an area. There might be maps, insurance maps, which show a surprising amount of detail about a town. When people were moving west, which is a big part of what happened in the history of our country, then having a map of something like the railroads to get across the continent in a week instead of a matter of months would make a big difference. Sometimes the maps might even have been more local when people didn't, pre-car, when travel was not easy, when roads were not very, very good, then railroads made a difference. So having a more regional map, you could use that to make plans about where you were shipping to and how long something might take. This is a contemporary map, but it shows the variety of canals that were in use in the northeastern quadrant of the country in the early 1800s, which made a huge difference in moving folks from the coasts into the interior of the country. The Erie Canal, for example, was a major way that people moved and got across the country, made it to Ohio and Michigan, and on from there all the way across to Canada. There are what are called plat maps that show ownership, who owns what land, where the building, at least the primary building on that house is, some of the features of the land. When you think about what maps can show and how that might relate to genealogy, one of the things it can show is land ownership. It can also give you a sense of resources. You can take a look at migration patterns with maps. And when you look at certain kind of maps, like if you look at a topographic map, that may help you understand why your relatives went to a church, say, that might look like it's further away on the map when you look at a topographic map and realize that there was a great big hill between them and as the crow flies, the nearest church. Then you know where you want to start looking for church records, for example. It can show political boundaries. A lot of states start with, they don't even necessarily start shaped like the states we recognize today. They start with one or two counties that practically take up the same state. And then as people move in, the counties are subdivided and subdivided and subdivided. And you can have a relative who, every time the census came around, has what appears to be a different address, lives in a different location, and they may never have moved. So there are all kinds of things that maps can do for us for genealogy. Now, one of the things, at the time that this country was first settled, we used a system of mapping that was called meets and bounds. And basically, if you needed to define a piece of land, you needed some points along the way. It might be a large tree, it might be a boulder, it might be your neighbor's fence, it might be a road, a dirt road that was going by. But the meets part talks about the boundary of each straight run. Not every piece of land was square or rectangular, especially along the coast, especially along the east, along the mountains, where there were hills. Then, you know, there wasn't anything but what you could see to decide how to separate your property from a neighbor's property. Bounds were the and the meets, I should also say. So each part of the straight run, no matter how many different angles the property had, there was a starting point and a stopping point for each run. It would record the distance between each point and its orientation. They were very careful about making sure they had good, generally had good surveyor's compasses to use to lay off the orientation. Bounds are meaning the more general descriptions where it's not necessarily a straight run. It's along a fence, it's along a river, it's along a coastline. And it also applies to bigger pieces of property. So one thing to keep in mind is that in colonial America, there were areas settled by the British, there were areas settled by the French, there were areas settled by the Spanish, both on the East Coast and the West Coast. And that made a difference to the measurements that were used. An acre versus a hectare, a vara, which is essentially the Spanish yard, versus the French, depending when it is, the French meter, and the British yard. They were all slightly different lengths. So that's one thing to keep in mind. One difference between, say, where the British and French came into America, and the Spanish, especially in Texas and in California, is that they were using meets and bounds, but they were often describing very large parcels of land that were free floating, whereas on the East Coast, especially the further north you were, things were related to other people's property unless the settlers had gone to a whole new town. But even then, you were often, when people would migrate to a new town in New England, they would set up property lines that were next to each other. So it wasn't free floating in the same way most of the Spanish land grants, Spanish ranchos were. When it comes to the mapping that was done, sometimes, you know, this is an example of a map related to California land grant. You can see how very simple it is. Sometimes they were actually quite beautiful. These are all from the early to mid 1800s. But they all share in common. North is designated on all of them, even on the most simple ones. And when you get in close, this one is a good example. You can see the house designated, and the little hash marks are showing the elevation, and other things are listed. There's some trees shown. So it's really, you know, this is one of my favorites. It's really quite beautiful. Then there also were some that were a little bit more three-dimensional, meant to give you a sense of what was going on in the map. The majority of these are in California. But most of the ones I've run across were very simple like this. And you can see that there's information about the rancho itself, but it doesn't reference any other point except the points of the compass. Now here's an example of meets and bounds on the East Coast. These are two brothers, Lawrence Crow and John Crow. This is a more contemporary drawing of an original. So that's why the handwriting looks it's sort of very 1930s handwriting. But if you take a look towards the center and you see this point right here and the word walnut, that's because that was a walnut tree. And here you can see the run, and it tells us what the direction was and how long it was, and it goes to a hickory tree. And then there's another one that comes down. If you go back the other direction, this walnut, here's the straight run to this other walnut. Here's a long run to a hickory stump. Here's a shorter run to a hickory. And you can see that neighbors are basically cheek by jowl in this. Sometimes folks named their land that may not have been a name for it right at the start, but it tells you how many acres and allowances. It was warranted on a certain date. It was surveyed on another date. It was patented, which means it was recognized at law. And so this is very typical of what would happen on the eastern side of the country, still with the meets and bounds. It's also very common. This is, excuse me, this is a partial description. This is the will of Gad Merrill, and he has a son named Gad. So in his will, here's an item. I do give and bequeath to my beloved son, Gad Merrill, 55 acres of land at the west end of my lot, called my wool cut, that looks like. To begin at the streets west and run east, the width of said lot until it basically makes 55 acres and no more to him and his heirs. The second son is getting the same thing. Asher Merrill is getting 50 acres of land, joining to his brother Gad. So you can see from that very simple description, it's assumed that people know what part of the home farm this would be coming from, and they would have the tools. Many people knew about measuring land and surveying to lay it out themselves, unless they needed someone else to do it for them. But it's not unusual that you'll get things described using the kind of measurements that were common at the time. This is similar. This is something in New York State. A variety of folks moved from Switzerland. They came in. This was there was a great big grant of land, and then a smaller part was granted, and then that was divided. And you can see down here that there are names of the specific people that this applies to. There's a creek that's involved. Here's another creek along this side. So this one is not the one that lays it out entirely. It doesn't have the details, but it does show how it's being subdivided. And it was very common in the 1700s that people didn't just head off on their own, they headed off with others. And in this case, they were heading off with others who shared the same religious beliefs. And also, a lot of people came to America because land was not available for the average person in their home country, whereas they could get a hold of some land in America. So there are some really great sites online, and in fact, this is one that Kristen will be popping the link in It's a surveying company, but they have a lovely description of historic units of measure. And one of the most important units of measure is the chain, which is also known as Gunter's chain. And that was literally a chain that was created by a variety of links made out of steel. You can see that each link has a loop on the end where a couple of rings hooked it to the next link. These big round pieces are the handles, and a chain, a Gunter's chain is 66 feet long. And that may sound kind of random, but the good news is it was in use because it fit with the normal measurements of land at the time. For example, when I was doing my forestry undergraduate degree and we needed to run a line through the woods on a compass bearing, there are 80 chains in a mile. And so in our case, we were not using a physical chain to measure each 66 feet. We had learned how to pace it off and go that mile 80, do the chain's length 80 times for a mile. But if you think of the early surveyors out there, in some places, things were not so bad. They might be open fields. It might be a time of year that was good. In other time periods, they would basically be crashing through the underbrush or going uphill and down, and it would be much harder work. They would have been camping, and there would have been at least 3 people in the crew, perhaps with some others along, in order to take care of this. Because 2 people would be running the chain, one would be using the compass to give the correct directions. I found a really great video that does a great job of illustrating it, and I am just going to play a little bit of it.
My name's Dale. I'm a surveyor here at Hart Square, and I want to demonstrate for you what some of the equipment is that was used by surveyors in the 1840s. The device that I have here is called a circumferer. It's a surveyor's compass. This particular one is from about 1815.
We have no sound now.
Side, so that my eye is in line with the needle and whatever object I'm looking at. So I'm measuring from tree to tree, the compass is put right in between that.
Yeah.
But when I make the adjustment, I read what the needle tells me and write that down in my book as the angle. The next measurement that I need is the distance. With those 2 pieces of information, I can then draft a map that shows that piece of property, that angle. So to measure the distance, we use a chain. The chain was a physical device that was a chain, but also a measurement device. This chain is an original 18th century chain. It is 66 feet long. Each link, 100 links that make up the chain, are 7.92 inches. It really doesn't matter because it's 1/100th of a chain. Land in the 18th and 19th centuries was not measured in feet, it was measured in acres. And so we used a device that made that easier to do the math. So rather than measuring in feet, we'd have to divide by 43,560. That's math I can't do in my head. But 10 squared chains was an acre. So if I had a piece of property that was 2 chains by 5 chains, I can get the area by multiplying 2 times 5 is 10, divide that into, or do the unit conversion from squared chains to acres by moving the decimal over 1, 10 square chains, 1.0 acres. So it really made the math much, much simpler than using feet. If we look closely at the chain, we can actually count the individual links as we pull the chain, or we can look for these pieces called the tellers. So in this chain, we have a hand that looks like 4 fingers. That's telling me that's 40 links down the chain. Right here, I have a single point that tells me it's 10 links down the chain. So the chain can be used to measure either way. It'll go 1, 2, 3, 4. The middle link is 5 or round, and it goes 4, 3, 2, 1. So the chain can be used to measure either direction. We look for the tellers, and that speeds up the process. I can also measure short distances with an offset staff. So the offset staff has these black and white colors. Each one is 7.92 inches or 1 link long. So the offset staff can be used to validate the chain at the beginning of the day, make sure that it's 1 chain long, and also be used to make offset measurements or small measurements in the field. As we measure distances that are longer than a chain, we'll simply pull the chain from whatever our starting point is, this tree, for instance, out to 66 feet. And at the end of that distance, we place an arrow. That marks the end of that point. Then we pick the chain up and move it down again. And we place another arrow at the end of that chain. The rear chainman will actually pick up the last arrow and put it in his empty quiver. And they continue to do that process. Then if you forget how far you've gone, you can simply look at the rear man's quiver, and however many arrows he has, that tells you how many chains you have gone up to that point. If you've gone more than 10 chains, because that would be a full quiver, then that's called an out. So an out was actually a unit of measure. Later on, compasses tended to have outkeepers on them. So every 10 chains, when the chainman yelled out, the surveyor would click another out. Before that, they would actually take a stick, maybe and put a notch in it for each out, or you could actually put a pin in your waistcoat buttons and move it from the bottom 1 on up through the buttons to keep track of the measurements. So when we measure the distance with the chain, I would then write that unit down in my book as well. So then I have both the angle and the measure in chains and links. The unit of measure actually allows us to measure down to the nearest 8 inches. But in practice, what we find is that they really measure to the nearest rod or pole. That's 1/4 of a chain or 16.5 feet. Sounds like odd measures today, but it made sense because land wasn't as valuable in that day. We measured it by acres. As land became more valuable, we began to think of it in feet. So modern surveyors will actually use laser rangefinders to measure down to just a fraction of an inch by simply sending a beam out there rather than pulling the physical chain. Now that I have both the angle and the measure, we'll go off to my surveying table and we'll begin to draft a map.
All right, I hope that was enjoyable to see. If you are interested in those kind of measurements at all, it'd be good to go back and look at, listen to it again, because it can be confusing the first couple of times that you work with chains. But they're it really, when you're out in the field doing the work, working with our acres and mile and not the metric system, then it works very well. So when America fought the revolution and won, a whole lot of the soldiers were offered land as a bounty for being in the militia or the army. And the country also needed to be able to get people into the unpopulated areas, needed to be able to sell land. And in order to do that, Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, realized that there needed to be a systematic way to set the land out so that it would be possible for people to buy it, and everyone would know exactly what they were buying and where it was. The meets and bounds wasn't going to cut it anymore. And so what happened was that they established a system that called the Public Land Survey System that was a rectangular system, and it used meridians and baselines as starting points from which everything was measured. Ohio was where they started this. Let me back up to the map for just 1 second. If you take a look at all the areas that are one color or another, you can see that there is a north-south running line, which is the meridian. There's a baseline running east-west. If you look at Ohio, you see it's quite mixed. That was because part of Ohio had already been settled with meets and bounds. And they also were trying to figure out exactly how to do this rectangular system. And they tried some different things, different sizes of townships, etc. So on this map, it makes Ohio very colorful. And there's special information about land measurement in Ohio. The states that are shown as white on this map are the ones that either had already been laid out so much in meets and bounds that they stuck with that, or Texas, for example, both because it was settled by the Spanish, but it also was a republic of its own for a while, and so did not do the same kind of system that the rest of the country did. You had to have a starting point. And there's actually, this monument is in Ohio, near the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. And it is literally the point from which all of the other measurements are started. So, and then there are reference points within each state. So meridians, the lines, they align with lines of longitude. The lines run from north to south, but the meridians measure from east to west. So when you have the prime meridian that runs through Greenwich, then as you move towards the west, the meridian is what's measuring it where you are east to west. As you move towards the east, anywhere along any of those lines, it's the same for the meridian. The baselines are parallel to lines of latitude, and latitude, the lines run from east to west, but you're measuring from north to south. How many degrees are you above that? And so the baselines run from east to west, but then it's measuring from north to south. This is very similar to the map that you just saw. It's from 1911, and it shows again the areas that participate or don't participate in the public land survey system. In some states, there is just one meridian and one baseline. In other states, like California, there are several because of the shape of the state. You can see here's a baseline that runs across several states. So most of the examples I'm going to pull today are from either California or Michigan. I had a lot of great examples because my family's from Michigan, and I have it was easy to pull together. It's also a good contrast to what's in California because California with the ranchos, Michigan before the British took it over, the French were there, and especially along the river and the Great Lakes, there are the kind of land division that is meant for being along access to a water, as opposed to the ranchos, which were great swaths of land for raising cattle, etc. So when we're in any particular state, when we're using the baseline and the meridian, each township as a unit of area, each township will have a description, an address that tells you either how far north or south of the baseline and how far east or west of the meridian line. And so if you've ever seen a description today of land that is on the PLLS, the Public Land Survey System, it will usually start with describing that land as part of, say, for example, Township 2 North, Range 1 West, and then there are further subdivisions within a township because townships are 6 miles square. They have each of the township lines and the range lines are 6 miles apart. Okay. And so if you have 40 acres in this township, we need something a little more specific and meant for the scale, more the scale of people than just what township you're in. I'm showing you this one from Michigan first because it's relatively straightforward. You can see the meridian coming down. You can see the baseline going across. I actually lived in Ingham County, and there was a meridian road, which I never thought about until one day I realized, duh, that's the that road is so straight because it is the meridian line. And so, you know, using this doesn't mean that every township is square. Often there are things that have to be accommodated. There may be things on the ground that, or just the geography may influence whether some of these areas, some of these counties, how the townships are divided up. And of course, when you're along a coastline, then a township could be, the townships along that edge are going to be very oddly formed. But within each one, it's relatively regular. And again, there are, when you see these little deviations here, that may be because there were roads existing that were hooked up to, and that was easier. You weren't going to put in a new road. Now, when I look at Monterey County, so here's the north end of Monterey County. Here's Salinas. Here's the coastline with Marina, Seaside, etc. When you look in along the river, you don't see the faint lines. That's generally because there was a rancho there that was granted. But when you get away from the river into the areas that were wide open, then you can see here are the township lines. And so you can see that they've had to kind of meld the effect of the rancho lands and work the public land survey system in around it. So townships, 6 miles by 6 miles for an area of 36 square miles. Each township is then divided into sections. Those sections are 1 mile square. So each township then has 36 sections. So the sections, and again, you can see that sometimes there's something going on in terms of natural features that is, the lines are not the exact lines that we would have in a perfect world. But this is one township and it has the 36 sections. When it comes to section numbering, there's a convention on how that's done. This is actually going to be useful. You don't have to memorize this, but if you happen to have relatives that are in an area and you are able to use what are called plat maps, which are maps of townships. So here's a township, right? 36 square miles, 6 miles on the side. Each section has a number. And when you look at a plat map, and they're mostly, plats are, the historic plats are mostly in the Midwest and mostly in a time period from about 1870 up to the early 1900s. Then these plat maps can just be stuffed with small pieces of property because this one section is 640 acres. And if you think about farming in the 1800s or the early 1900s, you are not going to have it on the scale that you might have it today. A small farm in where the soil is rich could be as little as 20 acres for a family to make a living. It might be, the richest farmer in town probably had 80 or 160 acres. So just a portion of a section. The convention for numbering is that it starts in the northwest corner, goes across, it comes down and goes back. Okay, so you've got all 36 numbers for the sections. And in every township, it's the same. That's why this township right next, here's where 1 started. That would go off this direction and come back to 12, come down to 13. Okay. The township above it, you're butting up against the bottom line. The township below it, you're butting up against the top line of the next township. All right, hang on with me, because within a township, chances are good that the subdivision is going to be just a portion of, and maybe a portion of a section. So this represents a section, and it's illustrating the ways that it can be subdivided. So within this section, this is the northeast quarter, just by way of example. Okay, if someone had a whole quarter, it could be any of these areas. But a quarter of the section, 640 divided by 4 is 160 acres. If you had a quarter that was divided in half, either running this way or running this way, then here is the west half of the southeast quarter of this section, right? So this is the northeast quarter, this is the southeast quarter. If it's divided this way, it's the east half of the southeast quarter or the west half of the southeast quarter. Here's another way to divide a quarter. It happens to be the southwest quarter. It could be any of them. But if it divides on a horizontal basis, then this is the north half of that quarter, which is the southwest quarter. This is the south half of that quarter. Now, a quarter could also be divided into quarters. If a quarter is 160 acres, then you can do the math if you divide that by 4. And so here is, within a quarter that's divided that way, there would be a northwest quarter of, and this whole quarter is the northwest quarter, right? So this is the northwest quarter of the quarter. This is the northeast quarter of the northwest quarter. Okay. So if you ever read that in a description that you find in a land grant, in a deed, in a will describing what somebody gets, you can pull up something like this, and it will tell you within that section, within that township, how, you can make sure right where the property is. Now, when surveyors were first sent out to survey each state, their first job was just to literally divide it into townships and sections. I chose this one to show you. This is from when Michigan was being surveyed in the 1820s. And these long, skinny sections are because there's a river. And when you're along a coast or a river, properties tend to be narrow and long because everybody needs access to that river or that coast, especially in a time when there were not highways or paved roads of any kind. Often rivers made all the difference for getting supplies, selling your merchandise, getting back and forth. You would not necessarily have taken a road. You would have taken a boat or canoe on a river. These are just a couple other examples of the initial surveying that was done when Michigan was still a territory. You can see that some very simple things are shown, like the the course of a river, that sort of thing, but it's not in great detail. Now, here is a county in Michigan, or a township in Michigan. This is, I believe, from the 1870s, and it shows, you can see, it's in the northern half of the lower peninsula of Michigan. And it's Burns Township, which is Township 5 North, Range 4 East. So if you took a look at the baseline and the meridian, you would be able to figure out what township, where this was by using those two pieces of information. But you can see within that 640 acres, there are a ton of people, ton of farms. And in some places, this is far enough north that people needed bigger chunks of land to make a living on. When you come into some of southern Michigan, where the soil was much richer, it can be even more intense than this, because a family could get along just fine on a much smaller piece of land, whereas up north you needed a bit more in order to do it. You know, you can also see this is a topographic map, and it's got Salinas. This is from, I think, the 1940s. So here's another kind of map that you can find out detail with. And Salinas had a number of ranchos. Nacional was one of the ones that part of it was sold to make Salinas. And you can see again where we've got this land, which is more freeform. And then when we come into, these happen to be the hills, you can see the township lines are established again. I just wanted to do a close-up of Salinas on this particular map, because sometimes there are lots of things that you can see or find out from a map. We've got, so here's, if you're from Salinas, you might kind of recognize this pattern. Here is Main Street, here is John Street, this is Abbott. 101 at that time was part of, you know, you had to drive through Salinas. It wasn't set off on its own. Here's the Alisal, which is now part of Salinas. But you can see, for example, here's the library, the Carnegie Library. Now the library is further over in this area, and we'll be taking a look at some mapping that shows us parts of Salinas, a different kind of map. Here is Central Park. If you've ever been to Central Park, it was the first park in Salinas. This happens to be a topographic map that is similar to one you see. It's in Michigan. Here's Dundee, Michigan, Monroe, and the eastern edge of Michigan is the next 2 townships over. But the River Raisin, the French settled this area of Michigan first, and so the river is has the French. It's River Raisin, you know, named after the dried grapes that were all over the area. And you can see where these river farms, the long, skinny river farms, give way to, you know, the next thing that happened was the section measurement, township measurement. And I wanted to just pull in on one area here. Here's a tiny little settlement called Grape. And Dundee is off this way, Monroe is well to the east that way, and you can see the River Raisin along here. Many of the features, we've got North Custer Road, South Custer Road. We've got a bridge identified. Here's a little island in the river. You know, here is that same land today. From a satellite photo. So here is Grape. You can still see the long, narrow measurements. You can see the various roads. Here's North Custer Road. There's still the bridge. And you can see that one of these long, narrow farms has been subdivided into just housing properties, not farms anymore. So back up a little bit, back down a little bit. And again, so you know, we were looking in where were we? This area over here, I think. There's another area. Dundee is where my mom grew up. You know, here we have another area off to the talking about what you can learn from a map. My grandma was a school teacher, and she in the 50s taught in, before consolidation, taught in a one-room schoolhouse. And among the one-room schoolhouses she taught in was Egypt School. Don't know why it was called Egypt, but you know, here are, if I had not grown up in this area, I would be thrilled to find, here's Heiser Road. When the map is bigger, this is Crow Road, so the two sides of the family. And here's one of the schools she taught at. I do have a photo of her. This was at a different one-room schoolhouse, Howe School. This is 1950, the class portrait, all those farmers' sons and daughters, and there's Margaret in the back. So it's amazing some of the things you can find on maps. Old maps often have old names that are no longer on current maps. All right, I want to do a couple of, let me just call them case studies for the moment. One of them involves insurance maps, and I want to show you some of the kinds of things you can get out of insurance maps. Insurance maps were created because insurers needed to have a sense of what buildings were made of, what kind of hazards they might be located next to. For example, a building that stored chemicals, or if they were in an area that had perhaps firefighting equipment. And one of the most famous map companies is the Sanborn Map Company. Many of their maps are available at the Library of Congress. There are a couple other repositories that also have Sanborn maps. Not every town has Sanborn maps, but when you find Sanborn maps, you can really work them over to learn a lot about the town that you're looking at, or the area you're looking at any particular time. And I'm gonna bring us in. This red is for the downtown area. And we're gonna take a quick look at some of the downtown, and we're gonna take a look at a more residential area, so you have a better sense of some things you might be able to get and how you might connect them to information available to you today. All right, so here's pulled in on one section of the map. Again, here's the red for the downtown. You can see Main Street. Again, there's John Street. This is at a time when the library would have been right in this area. Today is over. We are the southern half of this particular block. And so what I did to kind of set it up is each of these numbers is a particular map in the set that you're going to look at. And I went ahead and pulled 15, 16, and 18. When you look at the individual pages, they're set up, you see 18 is at a bit of an angle on this map. Well, the page itself is actually set straight up. And so I rotated 16, I rotated 18 to kind of give a better feel for the whole area. So again, here's Main Street. Here's where it crooks at San Luis. Here's the public library. Here is the lower block of downtown. There's much more going on up above, but you can see that behind this is mainly residential. And like I was saying, the library is now in this area. If you're familiar with where John Steinbeck Library is, this section is where the current rec center, which was built as a USO building. Just an aside for a moment, the USO building in Salinas was the first permanent USO location. There were a number of cities that were trying to complete in 1941, were trying to complete their USO building to have the honor of being the first permanent USO building. The USO was meant to be dedicated in December, and as you know, December 7th was the attack on Pearl Harbor. The USO building was actually dedicated on the 9th, was the day that had been scheduled. They went ahead with it. There actually were some pretty big league stars that came to town for the dedication of that USO building. Now, the first thing I want to do is I picked this particular block to look at first of the downtown because it has an interesting variety of buildings, and then after that we're going to take a look at which you can see is a pretty darn big house. So someone well-to-do lived in that house. So here we go. We're looking at downtown. We've got the Swiss Hotel. There were a lot of Swiss that settled in the Salinas area in Monterey County to start with. And you can see that there's a variety of buildings. There's a hotel, the Swiss Hotel is here. There's a saloon and liquor sales with a hall on the second floor. Here's an undertaker, a printing shop. The stage, we've got a couple of Chinese laundries. We have agricultural implements. And it was the Foresters building because the Ancient Order of Foresters, which was one of these, I think that's the correct name, one of these social clubs that were so popular in the late 18 and early 1900s, owned the building and met there. We've got a church. Here's the livery building, which if there was a hotel here, then a livery building made a lot of sense to have close by. Now I went ahead and took, I'm just going to focus on the Swiss Hotel so we can take a little closer. Oh, but first, the fire insurance maps had keys. Things are in, let me back up for a second. You see the different colors that things are. You see the letter D for dwelling, for example. The number of the X's, the little hash marks, all meant something about the nature of the building. And so it's important to make sure, if you want to know more about it, it's important to take a look at this. There's some fascinating things in it too. A frame building covered with asbestos. Well, that was pretty fire resistant. It's not what we try to have anymore. But you know, adobe buildings, stone buildings, there's all kinds of information about what's conveyed in the maps, so that you can really understand a lot about what kind of buildings were in that area. So here's the Swiss Hotel. The numbers along here are the street numbers. So this would have been 311, what was this, Main Street, South Main Street. You know, the undertaking building had wooden posts. There was a carpenter at the back. Was that the carpenter who, was that where they made the caskets? Was that an independent carpenter? I don't know. Here next to the hotel and the saloon is a cigar factory. It was a two-story building. There's various sheds. So I don't know what this says back here. I've not been able to decipher that, but you can see that there is a ton of information about the buildings in the downtown area. And so now, like I said, we're going to take a look at this house. I have rotated it for our purposes, so it's a little easier to read. Again, you can see this is a two-story building. For example, here's the front porch. There's what's on the first floor. This would be the porch on the second floor. You can see a bay window here. You can see there was some kind of a tower on the third level. Lots of sheds. These folks had a greenhouse. This is a way that you know that these were some of the richer folks in town. All right, so that's for the kind of retail, the business part of town. I'm now going to come over to the edge of town and just take a quick look at a residential area. Here's John Street that we've seen before. There's Abbott, Wynnum, Harvest, Maple, and we've got California Street and Front Street, and this is literally the edge of town over here. So we're going to take a look at this block right here between Maple and Harvest, between California and Front. And I've been over this pretty carefully. There's a couple of things I want to show you in terms of what you can do with this. You notice that some of these lots are a little bit odd. They have different front clearance and they're different widths. Most of them fall into the mapping. You can see the dwellings. Many spaces, this is in my neighborhood, so all of these lots are completely in use. The thing that was interesting to me is some of them have residences in the back. 209.5 means it's an actual address, so it was an actual residence. 221.5. And I want to take a look at this house, and I want to take a look at these houses up here, particularly this house on the slightly larger lot. And so what I did was I went on Google and I got that block. And so here is that house that I mentioned. Okay. And here's the other house on that lot that was a little bit wider. This is the original building. And you can see that they have added on a whole lot because that is not a very big, I'll show you some street level shots. That's not a very big house. Same thing happened here. So let me, again, so we're looking at this house right here. There it is from the street today. And you can see here's part of the original. This is probably part of the original. This is definitely not part of the original. You can see the kind of design, the windows, etc. But, if you found out that one of your ancestors lived in that house, then you could take a look at what the Sanborn map showed. You could take a look at what Google Earth showed, and you'd have a little bit of an idea of what had changed over time. So now we're going to take a look at this house. And again, it's up here in the upper left corner. Here's the original that you can see on the lot. And here's what's been added. And if we take a look from the street view, you can definitely tell this one is a pretty sympathetic addition in terms of working with the original house. But without getting rid of the original house, trying to figure out how to add more footage would have been very difficult for them. But there's a whole lot of info. I walk by this house regularly, and I knew that it had been added onto, but it wasn't until I was really looking at the Sanborn map that it kind of went, oh, I get it. I also want to mention another kind of map. We're looking at mostly 2D renderings, and there are a lot of 3D maps. This one happens to be of Salinas. It's what's called a bird's eye map. And I love these maps because there's lots of detail. When you get in there and look at the actual map, you can see the different houses that are laid out. Here is Lincoln and San Luis. So here's where the library is now. Here's the railroad depot. You can really see, in fact, let me pull in. So, so there's the area the library is now. Here's Main Street. Here's Alisal. And so you can get a sense of some of the downtown. You can see that people have probably orchards around it. Here's a water tower. There just is an amazing amount. And you can go online and look for these. Some of them are downloadable, for example, from the Library of Congress. Other ones, this map, I actually have a copy myself that I purchased from a company that cleaned it up and made it, made it resellable. And so if you have someone who has a town they love and you can find a 3D rendering of it, it is holiday time. Great gift idea. You remember this this particular area that I was talking about before when we were talking about meets and bounds? Well, it turns out, I looked around just to see, and this is not that exact area, but it is in the area. It's the town that developed near where those farm sites were. So when it comes to finding maps, there are a lot of different places you can look for them. I want to make sure that you know that there's lots of maps and lots of info about maps at familysearch.org. When you go to their wiki, you can pull up information on maps, and there's great education on what the different kinds of maps are, how you can use them, and within each description, there are links to the maps. I always mention Family Search because that's a free site. If you are subscribed to Ancestry, there are many maps that are available there. You can see here under Maps, Atlases, and Gazetteers. And a gazetteer is basically a list of place names at a particular time. They were published so people could look them up. And the old gazetteers are handy because you might be looking for a town or a location that the name has changed or it no longer exists. There are places you can go online that will tell you, including the U.S. Geological Survey will tell you the names of any particular town, what the previous names were, etc. And so this particular, I just pulled up this particular one. It's an index of early land ownership and township plats from 1785 to 1898. This is, we also have the indexed county land ownership maps, which are the plat maps that I was talking about. So I did a quick search for my great-great-grandfather, Russell Alonzo Andrews, and boom, first thing that came up was the right county and the right town from 1875. It's the map that I showed you earlier. What I want to show you right now, so I pulled it up to look at. What I want to show you right now is a way, how are you ever going to find Russell Alonzo Andrews amongst all of these? Here is my number one tip to you when you are searching a map of this sort, because it shows the numbers, okay? Each section's numbers. So I'm pulling in tight on this. So what I do is I follow the numbering routine. I start in section 1 and I just run my finger, literally run my finger. I go either clockwise or counterclockwise around that number. And you can see that many of the roads are set up on that mile square. So you have some natural boundaries. First, I check section 1. Then I move my finger over and check section 2. Again, just going clockwise within section 2. I go to section 3. One of the reasons these maps are so wonderful is because it is often the case that if your family is in an area, they would have married people in the area. And so you will probably find more than one relative. It's why when you find the person, like when I find Russell, if he's in one of the first sections I'm checking, I'm going to keep looking because I know that there are likely to be other relatives in the area. And so I don't just stop when I find something for Russell. It's also not uncommon that people might own more than one piece of land and the land might not be continuous. And so when you find an area that has your relative's name on it, keep looking because you may find out they owned more land. And so when I did this for Russell, the first time I found it, I kept going. And down here in section 18, I found him, R.A. Andrews, and his 80 acres. He also had, see this little arrow here, he had these acres too, and this appears to be the house that he had. I can see there's a little creek that was running through it. I can see who his neighbors are. And in fact, when I kept looking, pretty quick, I spotted his father-in-law, Nathan Pratt Merrill. So you can see that he was not all that far away from the family of the girl he ended up marrying. And when I looked further, I found, in fact, the grandfather, J.C. Merrill, and his land. You can also see some things like here's someone, Mr. Euler, who settled in 1840. There's just some other, you just never quite know what information you're going to run across when you look at these maps. But again, the map is much easier when you are working strategically by following the numbers and just by checking around each of the little property designations. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some other places to find maps. The U.S. Geological Survey has a National Geologic Map database, and they have topographic maps, including historic topographic maps. And again, if you're trying to understand why your relative was a crop farmer versus an animal farmer, you take a look at the land and you can see that it would not have been suited. That was too steep, perhaps, for crops. You can get a sense of what life would have been like for them to try to get around in their area. And so they also have the ability, like on this particular topo view page, they use Boston as the example, but you can use this slider, and as you slide it to the right, it goes back in time and shows you what the maps looked like at that time. It's kind of a cool effect. So there we go, the historic topographic maps and the collection. There are a couple different ways to search through it, but it's really, if you want to get a sense of what the contour of the land was that they were living on and what other kinds of things were in the area, it can be really useful. And look at more than one. If it's available in more than one time period, take a look at the different time periods to see the changes. And again, so you go in, you click on the area you want, or you enter the information over here choosing historical topographic maps, and it will help you find what you're looking for. When you find something, and here's just there were 7 results for Salinas, and it tells you what the time period is and what the scale of the map is. Not 100% sure why I had this in here, but it's here we are with Dundee again. Grape is over this way. I'm looking at this one, and it's got there's my grandparents' farm. It's after US 23 came in, so they're crowded by the off ramp. But the farm and the main barn, there's the neighbors, there's further neighbors. There's just it's very interesting. There's the school, the variety of things you can find on topographic maps, including like this old railroad grade, no longer in use, but still there and a defining feature on the land. Again, the example of Salinas, this is an early one. When it comes to collections, there are a number of famous collections that have a pretty wide variety of maps. The Perry Castaneda Library, which is in Texas, is one that has a variety of maps. I pulled up historic road maps. There is, I found this place called Map Geeks, which had some pretty interesting California maps. Another one of my favorites is called Old Maps Online, and essentially they have cataloged a whole lot of maps and provide the link to whoever holds it. So this is a good place to go, and they will send you to the USGS, to a particular library, to a particular university, the Historical Society, etc. And when you look at the maps, when you tell it what area you want to look at, it will tell you all the different maps that it has in its list. And it shows you the area that it covers, because some maps cover a larger area, some cover a smaller area. And then you're able to click through to whoever holds it. I pulled up another one. This is, Saratoga and New York State. And you can see that they have some fairly old maps, as well as newer maps in their links. So old maps online for links to maps all over the place. This is kind of interesting, the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries at newberry.org. One of the reasons this is interesting, like I said earlier, your relatives may never have moved, but the description of where they lived did. So I came in here, I clicked on California. It told me there are 58 counties in California today. I had several different choices. I viewed the interactive map because their first map for California is from 1850. You can see the particular boundaries. And then I just went through and picked at some other data points in the chronology of California. And you can see how there's some pretty big counties that have been subdivided since then. And so each date that you're picking, it will show you what the boundaries were at that time. So whatever state you're researching, whether it's California or anywhere else across the country, you can click through the list of all the changes, and it tells you. Let me back up for one. So it tells you that in February of 1901, San Bernardino was lost to create Riverside. It didn't go away, it just was divided. So if I back up, you can see down here. Okay, we go forward. So it tells you what the change was that happened. So very helpful. The National Archives has lots of different kinds of resources for genealogists. Land records are one of the most important, whether it was bounty, whether it was homesteading. And you can click in and see what kind of land records are available. And especially when you get a homestead description or a bounty description of the land, that can help you figure out, if you didn't know where it was, you can then track down where that property is. I'm especially fond of the David Rumsey map collection. I just pulled up one example of a Michigan map. It's called Farmers Township and Railroad Map. And I thought, well, that's cool. There were so many farmers at that time. It's good they had it. And then I realized the guy who published it was Silas Farmer. So if you see here, just above the window that the maps show in, view in georeferencer, this is super cool. You click on that and you can view and study the map. You're going to change the opacity with a slider in the right upper corner up here. Okay, so it tells you what you need to do. And it's got the map overlaid across Michigan. And so I fiddled with the opacity with this up here and brought it down to where I could see current Michigan through it. And he has maps from around the world. He has maps of all different sorts. And some of them are quite ancient. Some of them are relatively modern. It's really, he doesn't have maps of everywhere, but the maps he has are quite great. So that would be a good one. It's a easy rabbit hole to go down because you start looking at maps and you will drift away easily if you love maps from what you were researching. But I wanted to show you that georeferencer because that can be helpful with a map to take a look at what's shown on the map and what exists in the current day. All right. When it comes to taking historic information and plotting it into contemporary landscapes, I would like to recommend with you, I love Lisa Louise Cook's, oh dear, I misspelled her last name, it should have an E. She has Genealogy Gems. She also has, her videos are 11s with Lisa Louise Cook, and she has topics that are always really fascinating. She does incredibly good research, and she presents it in the way that whether you're a beginner or someone more advanced, you're going to learn a lot about it. It's everything from, this one is about land. I got a lot out of one. I have a lot of colonial American relatives, and she interviewed someone from American ancestors, and I learned a whole lot more about how to do my research. She has videos about tools that will help you do your genealogy better, keep it more organized, etc. So this particular video, which is pretty recent, Plotting Land with Google Earth Pro, if you know where your relatives were and you want to see what the land looks like now and you want to get the boundaries in there and you are not familiar with Google Earth Pro, she shows you some tools that will help you get the information ready to use with Google Earth Pro. It's just, I highly recommend it if you're interested in that. And for genealogy in general, she does just great presentations. I also wanted to mention the U.S. Geological Survey has a 4-page document about using maps in genealogy. It is from 2002. So most of the information about using the internet is either non-existent or is sadly outdated. But the overall information on how to get a lot out of using maps is really good. And some of the information, you're not going to send them a self-addressed stamped envelope anymore. You're going to look online. But the 4-page document was actually pretty good. So I recommend that to you with the caveat that it is literally 20 years old. And in this day and age, that's a lot. All right, we're going to stop for questions now. I just wanted to mention we already know our upcoming winter classes. Kristen will be popping the links if any of these classes sound interesting to you. We're going to do, I always do Getting Started as the first in the 3-part series. That will be in February. I'm doing a Using the Census Part 2 if you want to get ready to use the 1950 census, which will be released April 1st. And if you have some curiosity about the missing 1790 census, about how to make the best use of schedules, if you didn't know that you could still get reports that were written for the census going all the way back to the 1790 census to get a better sense of the social circumstances of the country at the time your relatives may have been alive, then this is the program for you. The third one is death and taxes, because nothing is certain but death and taxes. Neither death nor taxes on their own made up a class, but the two of them together have lots of information. It's going to take a look at the death part is about documents or records that would have been generated at the time that someone would have died. Includes a lot of information and access to resources about, many medical conditions have different names today than they did 50 or 100 years ago. People used to die of things that they don't die of anymore or hardly anymore, and so we're unfamiliar with them. And when it comes to taxes, there is lots of information, and there are tax records from various points throughout our country's history. And you can find out some surprising, interesting things about what your relatives were doing, and surprising, interesting things about what people were being taxed for, what was considered of value at the time period. So I would love to have any of you join me for any of those 3 classes next spring. Kristen, if you feel ready and you want to go ahead and share some of the questions.
I had questions. I had one question. I'm sorry I didn't capture the name of the person, but she wanted to know, how did the surveyors keep the chain straight from one point to another?
Well, that was a real challenge when they had to go through brush or undergrowth, and they basically had to kind of whack their way through. It was a difficult thing. And it's one of the reasons that each piece of the chain had 3 links. So you had a little bit of flexibility to get in and around things. But yeah, that can be a challenge for sure.
Another question that I had was, they wanted to know if you could provide the link to the video that you showed.
Let me, I am very sorry for that, folks, and I hope this works well. Let me get this into chat right now.
Well, she's doing that. Did anybody else have any questions? Because those are really all the questions. Everybody else is just giving positive feedback, saying it was a great presentation, good content.
Yeah, if you want to, I think at this point, folks, anybody who wants to unmute and ask a question is welcome to. Well, apparently I overloaded everybody. There is a lot to learn about maps and how to use them. And I will, I'm also typing my contact information. So if you have further questions or need some clarification, I should also mention that we have a bi-weekly newsletter for the library. And if you are not already signed up for that, an e-newsletter, that is a great way to stay on top of what genealogy related things we're doing. And I am happy, you can shoot me an email at the address I am providing right now, and I can get you added for the e-newsletter. Let me mention, we also have on the 4th Tuesday of each month, we have what we call the genealogy work group. And that is a way, you know, those of us who are doing genealogy, it can be a really solitary thing, and it's nice to have somebody to talk to about it. There are anywhere from 8 to 15 or so folks that attend. And we talk about each month, we decide what we're going to talk about the next month. So it really reflects what people want to talk about. Sometimes we have a presentation, other times we share tips and techniques. Everyone is welcome. It's 6 p.m. on the 4th Tuesday. That does fall between Christmas and New Year's right now. If you would like a link to join us, again, just shoot me an email and I would be happy to send that to you. Because it's a recurring meeting, once you have the link, you're good. You know, we use the same link every month. So it's a pretty friendly group. Like I said, it really has people who are just at the beginning of their family history research and other folks with more experience. So we generally have an enjoyable time, and you're welcome to join us. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to bring the gavel down then and say thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate you coming to this class. I hope I'll see you for one of the classes in the winter. Keep an eye out. We will post this to our Salinas Public Library YouTube channel. We are a couple of videos behind, so the deciphering old handwriting is not up yet, and using the census is not up yet, but they will be soon. And this one will be shortly after that. So very good. Thank you very much, everyone.